What is the keyboard to me? So, I'm, as you know, I'm a bit of a workaholic, and so it's a productivity instrument first and foremost. And so I'm very, like with tools that I use in prototyping or anything like that, I'm very interested in, obsessed with, and excited about anything that can theoretically enhance my productivity. So it's a productivity instrument first and foremost. It has to perform that function as well as or better than anything else. But it's also a an object that is an embodiment of a kind of idea and sort of nostalgic feeling in me for when I was first growing up and very excited about computers, sort of in the, I'd say, I guess it probably the early 90s when I was first learning to program. When computers were relatively rare and much more valuable objects in which we invested a lot more time and energy in sort of making sure that they were actually nice because they performed a function that was rare and valuable. And so the keyboard to me, mechanical keyboards in particular, and the sort of tactile and acoustic properties of them call back to that early era of computing that was very formative and exciting for me. So to me, the keyboard as like an emotional object sort of connects me to those hopes for the future that computing used to represent when I was very young. And it's why I often say I'm drawn to like retro-futurist aesthetics and stuff that I do, because I want to evoke that the visual aesthetic of hope for the future that used to be so prevalent and for better or worse isn't so much anymore. Another thing that I often talk about is the keyboard as being like a kind of totem for connection to the rest of the world. It's like it's our physical connection to the rest of humanity, given that so much human social interaction now happens in digital form and mediated by computers. This is like the first line of contact between us and so much of everything that matters in contemporary life, particularly as it relates to communicating with other people. So that's part of it. But also, there's this article I wrote a while ago for a magazine called Offscreen that really actually was right when I was starting to get into sort of the keyboard enthusiast community in a big way. And I was thinking a lot about this early era of computing and what made the feeling of participating in the internet and computing in that period different from the way that it is today. And one thing that I think about that's the most important distinction is the way we interacted socially online in that early period versus now. Nowadays, so in the early period, it was an extremely anonymous venue, and it was a place where those of us who felt like we didn't fit in with the physical world that we lived in, we could sort of escape to the internet world and have anonymous personalities, and we could sort of group together based on shared interests and commonality. And the internet of today is in some ways the exact opposite of all of those things. Rather than anonymity and joining together around the basis of shared interest without like competing necessarily for status, just like purely on the basis of shared enthusiasm. Nowadays, the very extremely social nature of the web facilitates the cultivation, the sense of the need to cultivate a kind of identity online, and the perception that one's status, like number of likes and retweets and everything, is like defining of who one is and like the principal motive for engaging with other people online, right? So it's like started out as this extremely subversive anti-status thing, and has become a conduit nowadays for people to just, in some ways, the worst social impulses of humanity to just be exaggerated and amplified. I think, as I said in the article, like in the early days, those of us who were very excited about the internet had hoped that the internet and its culture would transform the world in its image, and that it would be more egalitarian, that would be more accepting of weirdness and like strange like niche interests and communities. But in some ways, I feel like the real world has remade the internet in its own image, and it now just looks like, all of the things that normal people are preoccupied with. And so I guess I'm a little sad about that. And my interest in the like vintage aesthetics, retrofuturism, and keyboards is harkening back to that era, is about my attachment to it and wanting to embody my memory of that spirit, and also to try to like bring that into my contemporary life as much as I can, sort of just to remember this thing that I valued and what our original hopes for the internet and computing were supposed to be. The thing that caused me to become re-engaged with the like online communities in the first place is trying to connect with people who shared either a nostalgia for having experienced that period or just inherently liked it, even people who were too young to have lived through the period, but simply yearn for this idea of an extremely hopeful sort of computing empowered future. And so that's taken a couple of forms for me. Connecting with people who share my love of Star Trek: The Next Generation, which was a television show in a sort of fantasy world that perfectly embodied this idea of a hopeful, optimistic, technology-driven future. And so I first got into industrial design for the most part, making replicas of props from Star Trek: The Next Generation. I did some work for this company called Roddenberry, which made officially licensed high-end replicas of Star Trek props. And also people who shared this enthusiasm for sort of vintage computing, the feel of vintage computing, and keyboards. And so in some ways, I became okay with the contemporary internet and the social. I became comfortable engaging in social forums online because they allowed me to connect with people who also felt like maybe refugees from the rest of the internet, and who, if not were directly nostalgic for, kind of respected and appreciated this idea. And I feel like I don't know that this is necessarily a very conscious thing in the keyboard community, but the spirit of the early web, I feel, really does infuse the way that people interact in the keyboard community. They're an unusually kind and awesome and unpretentious group of people. I mean, I often say, like, part of my theory about this is because we realize that our hobby is fundamentally a little bit silly as viewed by everyone else. And so we're capable of not having certainly in person, occasionally online, but relative to a lot of enthusiast communities, the amount of flame wars and bullshit is surprisingly minimal. I find the spirit of the keyboard community gives me, sort of rejuvenates my hope in the potential of the internet to facilitate connections among people that are on balance positive. So that's definitely been highly motivating to me, and it's why I've been into this sort of keyboard thing as something that involves interacting with other humans, making things for other people for about 4 or 5 years. I've always loved keyboards since I was a kid, but it was only really when I discovered, oh wait, there are other people who care about this ridiculous thing, that I really started to get excited about it and be interested in physically making things for people who shared those same enthusiasms. As an adult, it's easiest to make the closest connections with other people when you can bond over something that really mattered a lot to you, or that you dreamed about a lot when you were young and before the reality had besmirched your hopes, right? And so if I didn't have keyboards and Star Trek to do that with, I would like to think that I probably would have had something else, right? And I think that type of emotional connection is ultimately what I care about most. I have this there's a pattern of things that I've identified that I've been talking about, of this sort of retrofuturist theme that I'm interested in, that sort of binds Star Trek and keyboards. But at a deeper level, I think it's most fundamentally just about making that kind of emotional connection with other people who, for whatever reason, share some preoccupation you have. And if it weren't keyboards or Star Trek stuff or whatever, I'm sure it would be something. And I think that's ultimately the thing that matters most. I'm sort of ambivalent about the concept of luxury as a term, right? Because there are definitely there's a school of thought about how you market certain products, and that is the concept of luxury. So if you think about like Louis Vuitton, right, or like more appropriately, the huge mega conglomerate, luxury conglomerate LVMH, right? They've worked out some kind of business formula that like creates desire and allows them to have really large margins. That's not, and oftentimes a core part of the premise of a luxury product is like that thing that I'm saying I fundamentally hate, which is status jockeying, right? And people oftentimes desire products in this that have been marketed in this way, or where scarcity is imposed artificially, because they want to have a fancy thing that other people don't have. I don't like that at all. I find that sort of deeply unappealing. However, there is a different way of thinking about luxury manufacturing and luxury products in general, which I think is much more reasonable and flattering. There's this guy named Jean-Noël Capfrère, who's a French luxury theorist. He works at like a business school, and I've read several of his books. And one of the ways that he talks about what luxury means is it's simply a way of creating a sustainable business model for low volume products, low volume manufacturing. The only way to make super niche things in small quantities, given the natures and efficiencies of like manufacturing at scale, is to figure out how to make products that connect with people emotionally sufficiently that they're willing to pay enough to get that product produced in small volumes, because getting products produced in small volumes is very, very expensive. And that is exactly the requirement, in my view, of how you make a keyboard business, right? It's not, there are very few people in the world who are willing to invest so much interest in and effort and value in such a mundane instrument, right? So for those of us who have wanted to make super fancy keyboards for a really long time, who've been organizing community group buys as they have been organized on like GeekHack and other similar sites for a long time, you just have to recognize that small volume manufacturing makes stuff expensive. And so there's been built up these kind of a small community of people who are where it is recognized, okay, we know that making 10 of something or even a few hundred of something is super expensive, but we care about this thing so much that we're going to pay for that. So this model empowers such things to exist that would not otherwise exist. So that's one part of it, is just like, I am interested in this concept of luxury, even though I'm uncomfortable with the term, because it is a business model that can make small volume manufacturing feasible at all. It's not a question of like having huge markups to make huge profits, because that's definitely not, I don't think anybody who's doing this, including the most successful people, are getting rich by any stretch off of it at the moment. But we just want to make this stuff that wouldn't exist otherwise. So it's a way of facilitating that. The second thing about luxury, which is in many ways connected to the first, empowers the first, is that it's about the reason why you're willing to pay to support that expensive small volume manufacturing is because it's something you really care about. And I think most people, at least industrial designers who have motives like mine, want to make something that connects with people emotionally, period. Like I said, to me, I don't care what the specific content is that I'm bonding with people about. I find that my most meaningful connections with other human beings in life are about at this like deep visceral emotional level, like saying, hey, I don't know why I love and care about this thing so deeply, but you do too. And that makes us like different from most of the people we meet, and we can bond together over that really weird thing. That to me is like the most special kind of human connection that exists, like standing together apart from the world with a few people. And so aside from like making logistical and business sense, it's just like personally rewarding for me to make that kind of connection. I never had any idea how hard it is to make stuff, how incredibly logistically complicated and expensive it is. A lot of things like there's one thing that I've observed in sort of contemporary American culture, and I think it's a side effect of economic policies in China and manufacturing policies in China. But like Americans all tend to, for example, anything that's made out of plastic, people assume that it costs like -3 cents to make. But as someone who understands how to make products, like an injection molded plastic part actually seems to me to be one of the most expensive and difficult products you could possibly make, because I'm used to only being interested in or thinking about producing products that would only appeal to a very small niche class of person, right? You realize like you'll see some custom molded plastic part that's made for like a niche thing. Like I encounter this a lot in photography, right? Little accessories or things that adapt one part to another. And I just think, wow, how many of these are they going to sell in the universe? I know that mold costs, $50,000, right? And most people who get it are going to be like, oh, it's plastic. They probably like paid, a few cents for it. And when you start becoming aware of like how much is involved in making all the stuff in the world around you and how much you need to sell of it to make a lot of things possible, it really does give you an enormous respect for the invisible makers of the world, because there's all of this physical stuff that makes up our universe. Very few of us ever meet anyone involved in the making of any of it. It's essential to all of our lives. We all meet programmers and accountants and lawyers and all of these things. So few of us ever encounter someone who either designs a consumer product that's used by many, many people, or certainly works in the physical manufacturing of it. And I can't nowadays help but look at that and think about it in everything I encounter in my everyday life. It kind of stresses me out a little bit in some ways. Just like, it's interesting that there's this whole invisible group of people making our lives work that we don't encounter very much or even think about ever. We take so much of our comfortable material lives entirely for granted, and without realizing that somehow if that like group of people disappeared, we'd be very much helpless. I definitely will make products even if it's a keyboard that I myself don't use, but not because I think it'll sell a lot. Only if I think that there's some interesting artistic or technical challenge associated with it. And so the Heavy 6, for example, was a departure for me in a number of ways. First of all, I never made a case where I was trying to sort of optimize for the weight of it. I liked the idea of this very compact keyboard, and I was trying to think about what it is that draws people to that over a TKL, right? And it's sort of like the density and compactness of the device. And so I thought it'd be interesting to make a design exploration that was around the idea of density and compactness. And so I chose these like sort of heavy industrial style bezels. I did things to optimize the weight of it. And several people had asked me to figure out ways of incorporating a small logo. So I did that. And in that project that was for a keyboard that I myself am not inclined to consume, I found all these other interesting things that were ways of playing around and connecting with people's interests and desires. So that is the prerequisite for me. There are many projects that I've done where I had absolutely no idea that anyone would want it. In some cases, they turn out to be sensationally popular. In other cases, absolutely not so much. I really don't care. It's totally fine. I do the things that are interesting and fun for me and hope that somehow magically the business aspects will work themselves out and people will be interested in buying stuff. More often than not, I'm pleasantly surprised in that respect. But occasionally, I just have a weird preoccupation or fixation or quirky thing I want to make, and I do it, and that's fine. Oh yeah, I would certainly strongly prefer a smaller number of people who are more emotionally impacted by what I'm doing. I definitely have a number of people who correspond with me pretty regularly and pretty much buy anything that I'll ever make, including the like tiny little variations. And oftentimes these are the most like kind and indulgent people who write to me. And that, as I say, that crowd of people totally energizes my work in general. And I need to figure out how to sell more of these things to in any way make the economics work out. But if I could just only like sell to that 10 group of people who are so excited to have my stuff, I'd be fine with that. It doesn't matter. Like I said, it's the intensity of the experience and pleasure and happiness that I can generate in individuals is what matters to me. I'm not interested in group size. I'm sort of interested in people who, my clients at the individual level, and how much they actually care. I don't want to, there are people who are sort of keyboard collectors and who just have 100 keyboards. Like, it's not super interesting to me to just make another thing for somebody to put on their pile. I'm much more interested in that small group of people who are like really paying close attention to what I'm doing, what I'm saying, the art that surrounds the product, and the sort of the conversations that I have online about it, and sort of my thinking that goes into it and all of that. I try to put as much information about what I'm doing out there as I can, but I don't expect, honestly, that a lot of people would care so much. But a lot of people really like very closely will study everything that I say, and oftentimes will even remind me of things that I said that I don't even like remember having said. And I'm always shocked by that, and I appreciate it. People paying such close attention to this random stuff that I'm doing. I think it's very presumptuous, would be presumptuous of me to suppose that there will be a lasting legacy, but I would want it to fall into the realm of all the things I've been talking about, which is, for some subset, if not all of the people who consume what I do, to look at things that I made, touch things that I made, use them on a daily basis, and have it remind them of or connect with something that they've cared about deeply for a long part of their lives, or that allows them to escape their daily life into a kind of aesthetic fantasy about the future, or just like being able to dream of possibilities of turning what is an everyday object into something that suddenly seems like a universe of potentiality, right? And being able to create these little sort of micro worlds and having them resonate with people is totally enough for me. It doesn't have to endure or last over time. Just that it happens at all or has ever happened is really all that I care about. Everything is fundamentally ephemeral. So it really, the notion of endurance is inherently illusory. Just like take moments of connection. I think that's the best we can ask for.